Hi there and welcome to another video from Hegarty Maths. It's Mr. Hegarty here and it's a Decision Maths A-level video and it's on critical path analysis. It's the third video in the series. What I'd like to do in this video is I'd like to again build on video 2 representing a project using an activity network, but this time we're allowed to use dummies. So I'm going to introduce you to the concept of dummies in this topic and we're going to use them in drawing an activity network. So to start with, there are two reasons why we use dummies, and it would be a good idea for you to copy those reasons down, and via examples I'll show you exactly what the meaning means. But the two ways are as follows. You want to show very clearly the dependence of activities on another, but in the case where two or more activities depend on a common activity finishing, but they also depend on activities that are not common finishing. So that's when a dummy is going to be used, and I'll show you why in a second. And also, each activity or arc has to be represented uniquely by two nodes. So where otherwise there would be two arcs going between two nodes, say if that was node 1 and node 2, and you'd have activity A happening and activity B, that's not allowed. Only one arc is allowed to go between two nodes as follows. So you would introduce what's called a dummy. But again, I'll show you in an example. So here's the first example. And in this, we're going to show the first reason you're going to use a dummy. So imagine this precedence table, and we're asked to draw an activity network. Obviously, we start off with our source node, which we're going to label 0. And we have activities A and B that depend on nothing. So A and B can come out of the source node as follows. No problem so far. Now activity C depends on B having been complete. So we complete off B and label that 1. And we have activity C coming out of it. So we could have activity C coming out as follows. Now D depends on A and C being complete. So what we could do, obviously we'd tidy this up at the end, but we could have A and C completing like that, so that we have activity D. And nothing is a problem so far. However, E also depends on activity A happening. So A has finished. If we drew E coming out like this, that would show E indeed depends on A. However, look, it also shows E depends on C. E does not depend on C having happened at all. So this, showing it this way, is causing us a problem. Okay, so what the problem is here is basically you've got two activities D and E, and they both have a common activity which they depend on, but they have an activity that is not common to them as well. So that means, so for example, E depends on C, but does not depend on A. Okay, so that's the reason you'd introduce a dummy in this case, to make that clear. So this is my mistaken one, so let me just put that up here. Let me show you what it would look like when I sort it out. So let's try that again. Let's try our source node, which is 0. Let's have A and B coming out. There's absolutely nothing wrong with A and B coming out like that. C depends on A, so we're going to C depends on B, so we're going to close off that, and we're going to have C coming out. There was no problem with that at all. D depends on A and C, so clearly C's got to finish. So I'm going to finish off C here, and I'm going to have that D's coming out. There's nothing wrong with that. So what I've done is I've shown that D depends on C. I've shown this bit here. But what I want to show now is I want to show that D and E depend on A. So what I can do is I can close off A like this, and I can have E coming out because E certainly depends on A. But how am I going to show that D depends on A? Well, what I can do is introduce a dummy like this. And you must show the arrow. The arrow is important. What that shows is that D depends via the dummy on A, okay, and D depends on C as well. But E only depends on A. Okay, and if we were to finish this off, E depends on F depends on D having finished, so we can complete this by calling that number 4. So F comes out as follows, and E must finish off now in order for the whole project to be complete. So we could finish that with a number 5 there, and that would be the correct answer. And we could draw straight lines for that. Okay, so the key is here, what was the reason this occurred? And this is what you have to write in the exam. They will ask you why you needed a dummy to draw that picture. And basically, you see it, a dummy, you see it when two activities depend on an activity in common, but they also have an activity that they don't have in common. So what we would say is our reason here, we would say the reason we had to have a dummy is because activity E only depends on A, whereas activity D depends on A and C. Therefore, a dummy needed. And that's what you'd write, and they often ask that in the exam for you to explain, and you would write a sentence like that. So let's just be clear, how is that related to 1? It's to show the dependence in the case where some activities depend on something in common, but also depend on something not in common. And you would phrase it the way I phrased it there. So that's the first type of dummy that comes up. Let's show you the second type of dummy, and it's simple example 2. Let's try and draw this. So we'll start off with the source node 0. A, B and C depend on nothing, so we just have A, B and C coming out as follows, depend on nothing, whereas D depends on A and B. So what I could do is I could close off, obviously I could draw straight lines here at the end, but D depends on A and B finishing, so we could close off A and B, and we could have D coming out like that, and C needs to finish before the whole activity is finished. So what we could do is we could have C coming up here, and that would be number 2, and that would be the end of the project. Now that seems okay, but here's where the problem lies. The problem lies here. Okay, now the reason there's a problem there is that every activity, if there is an activity, it must be uniquely determined in terms of the nodes on its side. You can't have 2 activities starting and finishing at the same node. That's not allowed. You want, when an activity finishes, when between an event here and an event here, you only want one activity between those 2 directly. So that's not allowed there. So what you would say is, you would say in this case, let's draw the dummy and then let's say the reason for the dummy. So what you would have is you would have 0 here as before. You would have A, B and C coming out absolutely just as before. So A, B and C coming out just as before. Now here's the, D depends on A and B. So what you could do is you could finish off B like we had there, and you could finish off A, maybe call that 1 actually and that 2 just because it seems more logical like that. They both have to finish for D to happen, and maybe you could have D coming out of, let's say here, there's no harm in having D coming out of here, but have an arrow like that to also show that a D depends on B. This way we've avoided the problem of there being 2 arcs between 2 separate, 2 arcs going between node 0 and node 1. There's a node in between here for B, and that's avoided that problem. And now we can just finish it off. C depends on nothing, so C could just come up here like that, and we could have that as number 3, and we'd be finished. Obviously we could redraw that there with lines. So actually let's in fact do that just to make sure we can do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to how best to draw it. I might have 0 there. I might actually do this activity thing above there's no harm in doing it above, so I'd have one there, maybe one over here, maybe do it something like that. And I can keep it all straight. So what I would have is I'd have one between here and here, one between here and here, one going all the way straight down to here, one coming from here, and also I'd have the dummy line here, which would be like that. So what I'd have here is I'd call that 0, 1, 2, and 3, and I'd have activities A, B, C, and D. And what this shows me is D depends on A and B, but you can't have A and B both starting at 0 and 1, so we introduce that dummy here, where C just goes off to the finish there. So that would be the activity network for that. In the exam, they typically ask you why you've drawn a dummy in this case, and what you'd have to say is, you'd have to say that, all you state is that each activity, so in this case A and B, must be uniquely represented in terms of its events, i.e. nodes. Okay, and then therefore you write therefore dummy needed. Basically what that's saying is it's saying you can't start and finish at the same node. One activity, two activities on their own can't start and finish at the same node, but you have to phrase it in this way to get the marks in the exam. So each activity, in this case A and B, must be uniquely represented in terms of its events. So you need a dummy. So they're the two reasons you need a dummy. Let's go and try and do some complicated questions where these dummies are involved and we have to draw the activity network in complicated cases. So here's the first one. You may want to pause the video here and try and do this yourself to start with. Okay, so in this question we're asked to draw an activity network using this precedence table. Okay, so we may need dummies, so let's give this a go. Firstly, let's start with our source node, so 0 here. Now, A depends on nothing having happened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have A coming out like this. I have it coming straight out because there's nothing else that doesn't depend. So A comes straight out here. Now, B, C, and D depend on A. So B, C, and D depend on A. So what I need to do is I need to finish A, call it 1, and I'm going to have B, C, and D coming out. So I'm going to have just B coming up here, I'm going to have C coming here, and I'm going to have D coming here, like that. Now I have E depending on B, so I can close off B and call it number 2, and have E depending on that. So I'll have E like this. So I'm all the way done up to here. Now F depends on B and C. So F depends on B and C being complete. Now this is, I should have probably pointed this out at the start, but when you see two activities depending on an activity, so they have an activity in common, but they have another activity which they depend on that's not in common, that's when you're going to have a dummy. So there's going to be a dummy going on in this scenario here. Okay. Similarly, you can see there's going to be a dummy going on in this scenario here again, because G and H both depend on D, but G also depends on F. Okay, so you're going to have dummies going on here. So let's keep going with this. Let's think what we can do here. I can't have, where does I get to? F depends on B and C. So I could finish off C. I'm going to need to finish off C, which is going to be here, which is a 3. And I want F to depend on it. But I also want F to depend on B. So I can have F coming out like that, depending on C. But with this arrow here, which a dotted line, I'm also showing F depends on B. And I've dealt with that case. Now G depends on D and F, but also depends on, H depends on D. So G depends on D and F having been completed. So what we can do is, if we completed off D and F like that, and we called that, say, number 4, and we had that G was coming out, that would certainly show G is dependent on D and F. However, H only depends on D. So we have H coming out here, but it can only depend on D, it can't depend on F as well. So again, we're going to need a dummy. So I'm going to undo this here. And F, what I'm going to do with F is the 1 on its own, I'm going to close off. I'm going to call that number 4. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to close off D, which I'm going to call number 5. And I'm going to introduce a dummy like that. Okay, this way I can have G depending on D and F by G coming out here, but I can also have H depending just on D, like that. So H depends just on D, like that. And lastly, I depends on G and H, so I can close these both off. They haven't both started at the same point, so I can close that off and be number 6, and I can have I coming out, like that. The only other thing that we haven't depended on was E, so E must finish, so this must come down here to finish the whole project, and that would be number 7 there, and the project would be complete. Now obviously we'd redraw this with straight lines, so let's have a go at doing that just so we've got that here. So I'm going to have 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 up here, 1 down here, hopefully we should be able to get it with this. So what we're going to have is we're going to have a full dependence there, dependence there, dependence there, dependence there. E goes all the way to the end, depend there. This is a dependence, this is a dependence, this is a dependence, and this one is there. And we're going to have the 2 dummies, 1 here, and we're going to have a dummy here as well. So what we're going to have is this will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And we're going to have activities, that's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and I, and I've got the 2 dummies. So what was the point of each dummy? Let's just state the point of each dummy. So let's try and do for the exam. Imagine they asked us the point of that dummy there. What's the point of that dummy? Well, the point of that dummy is because F depends on C and B, whereas E just depends on B. So for this dummy here, we would say that F depends on B and C, whereas E just depends on B, therefore dummy. Okay, and what's the point of the other dummy? Well, actually the other dummy is for a very similar reason. What's the point of that dummy there? It's because G depends on D happening and F happening, whereas H just depends on D. So it's because G depends on D and F, whereas H just depends on D, therefore dummy. So this was both 2 examples of the first type of dummy we have, and we're done in that case. So another example, you're probably able to do this yourself now. So we've got to draw an activity network using 2 dummies and explain the purpose of each dummy. So maybe pause the video and have a go, otherwise I'll go through in 5 seconds. Okay, let's look at our table first. I'm thinking there's going to be an issue here because S and T both depend on P, whereas T just depends on Q. So I'm thinking there's definitely a dummy there. I can't immediately see why there's going to be another dummy because it says there's going to be 2, but I'll find out as I start drawing it. It's probably due to reason 2. So let's have a go. I'll start up here. Let's start with our source node, 0. P and Q depend on nothing, so let's have P and Q coming out like this. like that, done, done. R depends on P, so we're going to finish off P, which I'm going to call it 1. I'm going to have R coming out like that. Done. Now S depends on P and T depends on P and Q. So obviously I'm going to have to finish off the one on its own. So I'll finish that one off there and I'm going to have that T's coming out. But I need to show that T also depends on P. So I'm going to have a dotted line here with an arrow, and that clearly shows me T depends on Q and it depends on P, whereas R just depends on P. Now I want S to depend on P as well, so because S depends on P, I'm going to have S coming out here like this. And at this stage I've got 3 things that haven't been closed off. Now I know that must come to the end one here, and these 2 must come to the end, but I can't have them both starting at 1 and ending at the end point. So I'm going to have to create a dummy for one of these 2 here. It doesn't matter which one. So I'm going to call that number 3, and then I'll have that coming to the end point here, which would be number 4. But I'm going to have a dotted line from S there. Okay, so let's think why we needed each dummy. Let's think about this. Firstly, let's think about why we needed that dummy there. We needed that dummy because T depended on Q and P, whereas S just depended on P. S and R depended on P, in fact. S and R depended on P. So what we've got here is we've got the first one is that T depends on Q and P, whereas R and S just depend on P. Therefore you need a dummy. Now why do you need that dummy? This dummy here was for a different reason. You needed a dummy at the end. It's because basically you can't have S and R starting off at the same node and finishing at the final one. But there's a way we phrased it, and we said that the next dummy is because each activity, and in this case we have S and R, must be uniquely represented in terms of its events. So therefore dummy. And that would be enough to explain why you needed a dummy there. So we needed 2 different types of dummy in this question. Okay, and at the very end, there's one more question for you to try. I suggest you pause the video. And just to reverse it, there's an activity network with a dummy in it. Draw the precedence table, and in fact do one extra thing, plus explain why you need the dummy. So you may want to pause the video now and have a go. I'm going to go through in 5 seconds. Okay, this should be quite easy for us. We're just drawing a precedence table. So we're going to have our activity here, and we're going to have our depends on column here. And we've got activities A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. So we've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. A depends on nothing. It starts off at the start, so A depends on nothing. B depends on nothing as well. Now D depends on A having happened. Look at that. D depends on A having happened. So and C depends on A having happened as well. So C depends on A and D depends on A. No problem so far. Actually, let's highlight these as we go along. Done, 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 and done. Let's go to E now. E depends on C having happened. So E depends on C having happened. So that depends on C having happened. So again, done here. Now F, this is where the dummy comes in. F depends on B and D, but also C via the dummy. So here we've got F. Well, it depends on B, D, and C. In fact, B, C, D, right, in alphabetical order. B, C, D. Okay, so we've done that one as well. G depends on D B and C as well. So G in this case depends on D, B, C and D as well. So this one depends on B, C and D. And the last one we've done that, so H depends on E and F. So H depends on E and F. Okay, now why was the dummy important here? Well, this is where our issue happened. These three here, look at this. This is where it all kicked off. And the reason is because of these dependencies here. And what we would state is we would state that F and G depended on B, C and D, whereas E just depended on C. And we're done. So obviously we just draw a line in there just to make sure we had a table, but now we're done in that question. So I hope you found that useful on using dummies to draw activity networks.